Hey everyone, it's Bond here from Dr. Pennsylvania. Today's past periodical is actually a series of articles from the Philadelphia Evening Public Ledger, January 7th, 1920. These articles take up the majority of the paper as they were about a very big deal. This gentleman's name was Grover Cleveland Bergdahl, who was a millionaire draft dodger at the time. And he was captured, and people wanted to hear about it. Thanks for listening.
Grover C. Bergdahl is caught in mother's home. Draft dodger after thrilling capture is taken to Governor's Island for court-martial. Mrs. Bergdahl threatens police with revolvers. Woman is arrested and held in $10,000 bail after hearing in City Hall. I'm glad, says son, who is losing nerve. He is found scantily clad and unshaven, hiding in the second-floor window box. Grover Cleveland Bergdahl, millionaire draft dodger the government has been chasing for 2 years, was yanked out of a window box at 8:45 o'clock this morning at his mother's home, 52nd Street and Winfield Avenue. Grover was discovered cramped in the narrow box and covered with blankets. Government agents pulled him out unceremoniously. One stuck a revolver in his ribs. Bergdahl threw up his hands in abject surrender. 2 hours later, he was on his way to Governor's Island, New York, in charge of Army intelligence officers. He will be court-martialed as a deserter. Mrs. Emma Bergdahl, Grover's mother, arrested on the charge of aggravated assault and battery with intent to kill, was arraigned at Central Police Station, City Hall this afternoon and held in $10,000 bail for court. The arrest of Grover, who is 26 years old, ends a 2-year chase. His brother Irwin, also a fugitive, was believed at first to be in the house. A search participated in by 30 government agents, patrolmen, and detectives failed to reveal him. The house is being watched to prevent his escape if he is there. Grover, a modern man without a country, recovered his poise when it was over, and he was on his way with the police. I'm glad, he said. The suspense was hard on the nerves. Grover was not armed when captured. Mrs. Bergdahl, however, according to the police, wore a belt with 2 revolvers. A Colt taken away from her when she was grappling with one of the government agents was a .38 caliber. A second Colt, found in the dining room with a plentiful supply of ammunition, was a heavy .44. The Department of Justice men and patrolmen who made the arrest divided up the cartridges removed from the cylinder of the Colt Mrs. Bergdahl had in her hand. Ever since the hunt last summer when the police descended on the house, the Department of Justice agents spent a whole day searching in vain for the Bergdahl brothers. They have been seeking quietly for a tip that would divulge either Grover's or Irwin's whereabouts. Among other measures which they took was to watch various young women with whom the Bergdahl boys were acquainted. It is said that they learned that Grover was home from such a source. Patrolman Charles McCready, a mounted man on the 61st and Thompson Street stations, got a glimpse of Grover last night, and to him goes the credit, according to his fellows, for the actual capture of the fugitive. He telephoned to Lieutenant Smiley, in charge of the district, and he in turn telephoned the federal authorities. Their clues were working out satisfactorily, and the federal men were planning to make a descent today on various houses where they might, Grover or Edwin, be hiding. The plans were to make a simultaneous descent on Irwin's home at Broomall in Delaware County, on the home of Charles Brown, a brother who changed his name, on the home of Charles Hall at Mount Holly, a brother-in-law, and on the Winfield home of Mrs. Bergdahl. When the hot tip came that Grover had been seen at the Winfield house, details were rushed in automobiles from 61st and Thompson Streets and the Federal Building. The patrolmen arrived first and threw a cordon around the house. Leo Gorman, Todd Daniels' assistant in the Bureau of Investigation, arrived with a half-dozen agents at the Department of Justice. It was shortly after 8 o'clock. Mrs. Bergdahl had not appeared. A group of neighbors who had been on the lookout for the Bergdahl boys since their sensational flight during the war gathered to see what was going on. Passing motor cars stopped, and their passengers stayed to watch what would happen. The Department of Justice agents had a warrant for Grover's arrest. A council of war was held, and it was decided to attack the house back and front. "We'll get him this time," said McDavid, one of the agents, "if we have to burn the house down." Leo Gorman and Leon E. Howe, the Department of Justice, with Patrolman Cassidy, Heller, and Fitzroy, went to the rear of the house. J.W. Bales of the Department of Justice and Patrolman McCready went to the front door. Mrs. Bergdahl appeared inside the front door armed. The Department of Justice man cracked the glass panel of the left side of the door with his blackjack, and the patrolman hammered out the thick plate glass with a mop handle he had picked up. Mrs. Bergdahl thrust her arm through the aperture. "You thieves and robbers," she shouted, "I will shoot." The men dodged back out of the way of the menacing black mouth of the revolver. Then Mrs. Bergdahl's attention was attracted by the noise of the attack at the rear. The men there found the door locked and fired their revolvers through it. Mrs. Bergdahl, revolver in hand, rushed to the rear almost simultaneously. Both doors gave way before the assaults of the besiegers. Mrs. Bergdahl defended her son with the fierceness of a tiger. She threatened to shoot the agents and patrolmen who broke their way into the house. She was disarmed only after a struggle with the Department of Justice agent and a patrolman. The arrest of Grover was dramatic. The house was surrounded. A simultaneous attack was made on it, front and rear. The great glass panel of the front door was battered in, Mrs. Bergdahl appearing at the opening to defend her home and her boy, armed with the Colt, with which she threatened to shoot the officers. "I'm sorry I didn't shoot you," she shrieked, after they had entered the house and captured her son. The house was an arsenal. Virtually every room of the 24 in the huge stone edifice, which is one of the most prestigious in the Winfield district, contained arms and ammunition. Federal agents took away with them to the federal building 2 Krag Jorgensen rifles with Maxim silencers, 18 revolvers, 12 stilettos, and an assortment of shotguns. Still, other weapons were left in the house. Mrs. Bergdahl put up a brief fight. Howe, a small man weighing considerably less than Mrs. Bergdahl, but just out of the army and full of fight, made a flying leap at her. He had his own revolver in his hand, and he and the infuriated woman swayed about, both revolvers sticking in the air. Patrolman Cassidy closed in on the pair, grabbing both weapons because he could not tell which was Mrs. Bergdahl's. After she had been disarmed, she gave up further resistance and sank on a chair in the ornately furnished hall, panting for breath. Then began the search of the house, while the mother looked on. Patrolmen and agents covered every floor, a squad being left on each floor after the search had passed. Mrs. Bergdahl was forced to go the rounds with them. They found doors and closets locked, but she produced keys and opened each. They collected miscellaneous assortment of weapons as they descended from the Grover's room on the 3rd floor. There was not a sign of the fugitive. Patrolman Carroll, McCready, and Bates, coming from the 3rd floor to the 2nd, stopped to search a window box. Clear up on the side of the house runs a huge bay window. On each floor, the lights are composed of beautiful stained glass. The windows on the landings are furnished with broad window seats under which there are boxes. Carroll and McCready both lifted the lids of the window box after they had taken off the cushions and sofa pillows covering it. There were half a dozen lids, side by side in a semicircle. They lifted 2 lids and saw nothing. One of the patrolmen lifted a third and saw a pile of blankets. The blankets moved. "Here he is," shouted Carroll. Under the blankets and heavy comforters, couched on cushions, lay Grover, huddled up to fit in the coffin-like window box. The patrolman dragged him out of his hiding place. "Throw up your hands," they commanded. At first Grover, who seemed dazed, did not obey. "Hold up your hands," they repeated. At the same time, a revolver was thrust into Grover's ribs with a force that made him grunt. His hands went high into the air. All right, fellows," he said. "I'll come along." He accompanied them downstairs. His mother sat stunned in a big carved armchair in the hall. Grover was meanly dressed, as though he had tried to disguise himself. He wore an old pair of trousers ripped at the back and held together with a bit of wire. In the pocket of his trousers they found $105, just a little change, his mother had said of it. He had no gun on him. Grover was not allowed to remain long in the house. Todd Daniel, head of the Bureau of Investigation here, called the house on the telephone a few minutes after the capture. Mrs. Bergdahl answered. The chief asked to speak to Gorman. Why don't you hurry up and send Bergdahl in? Daniel asked jokingly. We're waiting for you to send a machine, answered Gorman to Daniel's surprise. The chase had ended sooner and better than expected. Grover was given no chance to put legal barriers in the way. For that reason, he was not turned over to the city authorities. He was hustled into a federal building in an automobile, chatting on the way and apparently not much concerned. So swiftly was he taken away in the closed car that he had no time to get other clothes. His mother later sent him a suit, collar, shirt, and tie. Agent Clark took Bergdahl to the Broad Street station. There he was put in charge of Captain Jesse Cottrell and Sergeant J. Sparks of the Army Intelligence, and hurried away handcuffed to Governor's Island. Mrs. Bergdahl seemed depressed after her son was gone. She walked about the house or sat with her hands in her lap in the big carved armchair in the hall. Now and then she would try to argue with the officers at her son's arrest. She said fiercely that he had done nothing for which he should be arrested. My poor boy, she cried, he was never given a fair chance. He has been hounded by the authorities and the newspapers. She had been asked to find some clothes for Grover. How can I, with all these men about? She asked. If you will all get out, I will go and get his clothes. The detectives finally told her that she was under arrest too and had better hurry with her preparations. After this, she protested, though less vigorously than at the arrest of her son. What am I arrested for? She asked. There was no answer. For a few moments she sat in the hall, her hands in her lap as before, her face pale and drawn and a vacant look in her eyes. What am I going to do about my mother who lives with me and she is 81? Who is going to take care of her if I go? She was advised to telephone to some of her relatives and get them to come to her home. At her request, one of the detectives called up Irwin's brother-in-law, Hall, at Mount Holly, and asked him to come to town to put up bail for her. She went to the telephone herself finally and held a brief conversation with him. She did not seem greatly surprised at her arrest, judging from her words. She simply said, They have arrested me. Come down to City Hall with bail. She did not tell Hall that Grover had been arrested. Finally, the mother went upstairs to prepare to accompany the policeman. She had been arrested by the city and not federal authorities on a charge of assault and battery with intent to kill because she had pointed the revolver at them. At the time of her arrest, Mrs. Bergdahl, who is a short and stout woman, had been dressed plainly in a faded house dress. She put on a very plain blue dress and black plush coat with a white fur collar, and a small black hat with a white top. She also changed her shoes. Then she announced she was ready. Before dressing, she had insisted on going out to the barn to feed and water the cow, and she got herself in a little breakfast in the kitchen, some cereal, bread, and coffee. All the while that Mrs. Bergdahl was getting ready to go with the police, her mother, who is stout and pale in spite of her 81 years, stood at the window of the dining room, looking out at the crowd which surrounded the house and smiling to herself. Mrs. Bergdahl went and sat beside her when she was changing her shoes and conversed briefly with her in German. The older woman did not seem much perturbed. Mrs. Bergdahl bore her arrest as she had borne the arrest of her son, without flinching. She cried a little while she was eating her breakfast, repeating that her son had not been treated fairly and telling the patrolman who guarded her that this was only one of many troubles. Irwin's wife died only 8 months ago, she said, and I have that trouble too to face. When Mrs. Bergdahl left the house, escorted by 2 detectives and a cordon of patrolmen, the crowd outside laughed and jeered. She was hustled into a patrol car. A Negro chauffeur nearby remarked, "That's her limousine." Todd Daniel, chief of the Bureau of Investigation of the Department of Justice here today, told of the planned operation preliminary to capture Grover Cleveland Bergdahl. Mr. Daniel is frank in his gratification at having at last brought to justice the man who for more than 2 years has defied federal authorities throughout the country. It is a burden lifted from his shoulders, he said, and incidentally will relieve a certain tension under which his office has suffered because of the charges of incompetency whenever Bergdahl was concerned. Telling of the experience today and the steps that led to his capture, Mr. Daniel said, "Realizing that Bergdahl must be caught at all hazards, we went about the business of apprehending him in a quiet but efficient way. Mr. Kane, the United States District Attorney, and I sent to Washington for a good man to be assigned exclusively to the Bergdahl case." The man came in the person of Joseph O'Connor. This operative spent several months on the case and finally learned that Grover Bergdahl and his brother Irwin both made frequent visits to Philadelphia. Having good reason to believe that Bergdahl was in the city last night, we took advantage of the fact that we had a number of extra agents here on account of the Red raids and set about to search various premises where the fugitive might be found. The places searched were the homes of Mrs. Bergdahl at 52nd and Waynfield Streets and the homes of Charles Brom of Broomhall, Delaware County, the farm belonging to Irwin Bergdahl and other fugitive brother, the home of William Parker Broomhall, that of Eugene Stretcher Broomhall, and also the home of Charles Hall, brother-in-law to Grover Bergdahl at Mount Holly. Squads were organized under Agents McDevitt, Turvis, Ford, Gorman, and myself. They separated and each went to one of the places to be searched. It happened that Gorman's squad searched the Bergdahl home on 52nd Street and captured the man this morning. On my return to my office, feeling disappointed at my failure to find anything, I telephoned to Bergdahl home and found out what Gorman had done, and Mrs. Bergdahl answered the phone in a sad sort of voice. I asked for Gorman, and he told me on the phone that he had his man. I was so surprised I could hardly believe it, as I had expected to capture him at the farm at Broomhall. They brought the prisoner to my office, and I turned him over to Captain Jesse S. Cottrell of the Military Intelligence Service, who took him to Governor's Island, New York, to await general court-martial on the charge of desertion. We shall later take action against him in this department on the charge of evading the draft. Both Grover C. Bergdahl and his brother Irwin Bergdahl have been veritable will-o'-the-wisps for more than 2 years. The former, in particular, was the subject of numerous reports. He was reported as appearing in a number of cities and was said to have visited his mother's home several times while police and government men held fruitless vigil nearby. Grover Bergdahl has a penchant for the spectacular for many years. The son of a wealthy brewer, he is said to have been supplied in the unlimited means. Frequently, before the war, he clashed with the authorities over his mania for speed. In 1911, he paid a $350 fine for automobile speeding. He became known as the terror to other motorists and pedestrians in the section near his home. In February 1912, he was arrested on the charge of beating and threatening to kill a policeman. The lure of fast motor cars gave way to a zest for airplane racing later. In July 1912, Grover raced a Devon horse show train, beating the train neatly. Grover Cleveland Bergdahl, awaiting the general court-martial at Governor's Island as a deserter from the United States Army, faces any penalty the military authorities care to impose. The extreme punishment for desertion in time of war is death. Bergdahl is also liable for the prosecution United States courts as an evader of the draft. On conviction, a draft dodger is subject to a sentence of not more than 1 year in a federal prison. He had an exciting career. In August 1913, Grover Bergdahl flew from Lanerick to Atlantic City. It was said that same month he was warned to quit flying over the beach at Atlantic City and over rooftops in the city. The year following, he began experiments with the X-ray. The father of a small boy sued him for $6,000 for burning the child with the powerful ray. In December 1915, a jury declared him mentally sound and able to take care of his own affairs. Both Bergdahl fugitives were reported to be trapped in their mother's home last August. It was said Grover, driving an open touring car, had visited his mother's home 3 times in one day. Irwin was said to have come to the house in the evening of the same day. When on the following morning federal agents tried to gain admittance to the house, they were held at bay by the mother, who asserted the officers could not enter without a search warrant. Bench warrants for the arrest, both brothers, classed as deserters from the Army, were later shown to Mrs. Bergdahl, but she persisted in her refusal. At length, the search warrant had been obtained. The mother suddenly changed front and invited the federal agents to search the residence, but none of the fugitive was found. It was believed that they had fled through a strip of woodland in the rear of the house. Mrs. Bergdahl subsequently was arrested on a charge of assisting her son to evade military service. She was acquitted in the United States District Court here. Governor's Island awaited Grover Bergdahl with no more expectancy than would attend the coming of a soldier who might be accused of failing to salute a superior or other trivial military offense. An ordinary cell in the post guard house will house him until the details of his trial are arranged. Should conviction result, he will be transferred to the military prison at the post. At the office of the post, Commandant at Governor's Island said it was that no special order relative to his disposition of Bergdahl had been received. "We've not heard of him or his case," casually said a member of the post commandant's office at the Governor's Island over the telephone. "But we will care for him the same as other prisoners. So far as we are concerned, his coming is a matter of routine, and he will be treated according to our rules. If he hasn't been convicted, he will be kept in the post guard house until his trial. But we will take good care of him until the government takes him out of our hands." Bergdahl spent $13,000 in flight. Draft Dodger was in more than 100 cities and towns. Once arrested on auto charge. Hungry, he is given a meal. Grover Bergdahl spent between $12,000 and $13,000 in his 2 years attempt to avoid arrest as a draft evader. Seated this afternoon in a little restaurant in Cortlandt Street, New York, a federal agent on either side of him, their eyes watchful, he ate like a famished man and intermittently told of his experiences. "I'm hungry as a dog," he said once. "This is the first bite I have had today." Bergdahl, who stopped for lunch, was made on his way to the Army prison at Governor's Island, said that his desperate efforts to escape the government's clutches had led him all over the country. He was in Milwaukee, in Chicago, Omaha, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, 100 other cities and towns and hamlets. "And my God, I'm thankful it's over now," he exclaimed once. "It's been a terrible time. I had about reached the point of giving myself up when they got me this morning." Grover said he arrived at his mother's home Monday night, having come there from Wilmington, Delaware. Sunday night he spent at a little hotel between Wilmington and Newark. "I was pounding my ear in my bed this morning," he explained, "when I heard a battering on the front door. Good night, I thought, they've got me, and then I ran for that window box and hid myself." Bergdahl said he just one narrow escape from capture by the government agents. It was late in 1917, the year of his flight. "It was out in Milwaukee," Grover said with a grin at the recollection. "I had put my car in a garage there and gone into hiding. 12 days later I went back to the garage. I was nearly scared to death to see my name, Bergdahl, scrawled on the front tires." The garage proprietor came up to me, a funny look in his eyes. "Say, young fellow," he demanded, "where have you been? There's been a couple of guys here looking for you. They waited 10 days and then they beat it." Grover said, laughing, that he had given the garage man some song and dance and then had dusted out for Chicago. Once, Grover was actually arrested. That was in Peoria, Illinois. He was arrested for driving with the cutout open, and brazenly he gave his own name. Nobody recognized him for the widely sought-after draft dodger. "A bunch of hams out here," observed Grover with a chuckle. In Chicago, Bergdahl fell in with another guy whose name he withheld, and they went by automobile to Hammond, Indiana, where the axle of Grover's big car broke. "I shipped the old boat back to Philly," he commented. and bought another when I hit California. It was at this point that Grover told of the $12,000 to $13,000 his flight had cost him. Who had supplied him with funds or how this money had been sent, he wouldn't say. From Hammond, I worked out to the Pacific coast, he said, and then I got myself a new car and went from city to city. By easy stages, Bergdahl finally made his way back east. For a time he was in Virginia, then Maryland. He said he was never farther south than Nashville, Tennessee. During the ride from Broad Street Station to New York today, Bergdahl sat in the smoker. He was handcuffed to Sparks, one of his guards. Few persons in the car knew of his identity, the unshaven youth, or the disreputable clothing, but many saw the handcuffs and kept their eyes on him. Grover bore their scrutiny lightly. He chatted easily with the government men. He looked out the window with interest. He took out a plug of tobacco and put a generous hunk in his mouth. At Manhattan Transfer, Bergdahl was taken from the car and put aboard another train for downtown New York. The air was raw. Grover shivered a bit. "Here," said one of the government men, "put this on," and Grover was handed an army overcoat. He was grateful and said so. But by the time the train slid into Cortlandt Street Station, Bergdahl had found the coat burdensome and flung it open. He was taken at once into the little restaurant. Every little while, as he ate, he would pause to explain. "Gee, I'm glad it's over. It wasn't as easy as you think." Grover's meal finished, he was taken immediately to Governor's Island.